168 men, 80,000 soldiers, 0 Spanish killed. Those are the numbers everyone knows. They are not the numbers that matter. November the 16th, 1532, Cajamarca, Peru. The most powerful emperor in the entire Western Hemisphere sat in an open plaza, surrounded by his army, and waited to receive a group of strangers, 168 of them, who had walked through his mountains without asking permission. He wasn't scared. He had 0 reason to be scared. He had 80,000 soldiers camped just outside the city walls, men who had fought the length of the empire and won every engagement they'd entered, warriors who had just finished a 4-year civil war and come out on top. 168 strangers. By sunset, the emperor would be in chains. But here's the thing, and this is the part that changes everything once you really hear it. What happened at Cajamarca was not decided at Cajamarca. It was decided 5 years earlier, 3,000 miles away, by something that no one standing in that plaza could see, could touch, or could fight. Not a general, not a battle plan, not a god, a pathogen. Variola major, smallpox, had crossed an ocean it had never crossed before. It had traveled 3,000 miles along roads that were never built to carry it. And somewhere along those roads, it killed the one man whose death made everything that followed not just possible, but inevitable. Here's what the history books get wrong, what Hollywood gets wrong, what basically everybody gets wrong. The Spanish didn't conquer the Inca Empire. They showed up after it had already been conquered. By a disease. 5 full years before Pizarro set foot in Peru. So this is not the story of how 168 Spaniards somehow pulled off the most lopsided military victory in recorded human history. That story, the one where Spanish steel and Spanish horses and Spanish guts won the day, that story is the surface, and the surface is wrong. This is the story of how an empire of 12 million people was undone by a single death. One death. A death that happened before any European had ever laid eyes on the Andes Mountains, before any Spanish soldier had ever heard the word Cajamarca, before the war that destroyed the Inca world had even started. One emperor, one disease, one missing heir. That's what this story is actually about. By the time we hit the 1-hour mark, you're going to understand what the Inca Empire actually was, not the simplified version, but the real thing. And you're going to see exactly why its single greatest strength became the road that carried its own destruction straight to its front door. By the midpoint, you'll see the Civil War, the war that happened before Pizarro arrived, the war that broke the empire's spine before a single Spanish boot touched Andean soil. And by the end, by the very end of this, you'll have your own answer to the question this story has been asking for 5 centuries. Was any of it avoidable? Or was the outcome sealed the exact moment one dying emperor failed to name his heir? Let's begin where this story actually begins. Not in Spain, not at Cajamarca, not on a battlefield. On a high Andean road in a city called Quito, where the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere was lying in his palace, dying of something he had never seen in his life and could not name. To understand what was lost, and I mean really understand it, not just intellectually but in your gut, you have to first understand what was there. By 1520, the Inca Empire was the largest empire in the entire Western Hemisphere. Full stop. No close second. We're talking about one of the largest political entities on the face of the earth at that moment in history. Tahuantinsoou, the Four Quarters. That's what they called it. And it stretched 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, from what is now southern Colombia all the way down to central Chile. It governed an estimated 12 million people, 12 million, across some of the most brutally extreme terrain this planet has to offer. Coastal deserts so dry that some areas receive literally zero measurable rainfall in a given year. High-altitude plains sitting above 12,000 feet, where the air is so thin your lungs burn just walking uphill. Tropical jungle so dense and hot that armies have gotten swallowed whole trying to push through it. Volcanic peaks that scrape the sky at 22,000 feet. 12 million people across all of that. And here's the part that should genuinely blow your mind. They did it without the wheel, without iron tools, without a written language in any form that Western scholars initially recognized. No wheel, no iron, no writing. What the Incas had instead was something more remarkable than any of those things. They had roads. 25,000 miles of engineered roads connecting every single corner of the empire. Stone-paved highways cutting across the Andes at altitudes above 15,000 feet. Altitudes where your average person today would be gasping for a breath and reaching for oxygen. Suspension bridges spanning river gorges hundreds of feet deep, braided from iku grass and Andean fiber, rebuilt every 2 years through communal labor, and so structurally sound that Spanish soldiers, riding horses, crossed them without dismounting. Think about that, bridges built from grass, strong enough to carry a horse. And along those roads ran the chasqui, relay runners, specialized messengers stationed at posts every few miles, each one running his leg of the route at full speed before passing the message, verbal or encoded in a quipoo, a knotted string record, to the next runner waiting ahead. A message could travel 1,500 miles in a single week using this system. 1,500 miles, 1 week. The roads were the empire. That's not a metaphor, that's the literal truth. Without those roads, 12 million people scattered across 2,500 miles of vertical terrain could not have been governed, could not have been fed during famines, could not have been defended, could not have been an empire at all. With those roads, a single man sitting in a palace in Kosco could project his authority to the absolute edge of the known world. Those roads would also carry the thing that destroyed everything. But we are not there yet. Now, the Inca Empire was not simply a political entity. It wasn't just a kingdom. It wasn't a confederation of tribes. It was something more foundational and more total than those words suggest. It was a theological entity. The Sahpa Inca, the emperor, was not a king in any European sense of the word. He wasn't a man who governed by consent or by inherited legal title or by the grace of some distant church that could theoretically remove him. He was the son of Inti, the sun god. He was divine, not symbolically divine, not the people believe he is touched by God divine. He was divine. His word was the word of the sun itself made audible. And this had practical, structural consequences that reached into every corner of how the empire actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. The entire imperial machine, the roads, the food storage network, the army, the labor tax system called the mita, the administrative structure that governed 12 million people, all of it existed as a direct extension of the emperor's divine will. Every official, every general, every regional governor derived every gram of their authority directly from him. Every major decision, every military order, every emergency response to a flood or a famine moved through him. Which means, and here is where the story really starts, the empire had one point of catastrophic failure. One, just one, the emperor himself. And in 1527, something hit that point directly. What killed the emperor before any European even reached him? And why did his death make everything, the Civil War, the Spanish conquest, the death of 12 million people, why did it make all of that not just possible, but basically inevitable? The answer is already traveling south, along those roads. To get the full picture of what was about to happen in Peru, it helps to look north first, to Mexico, 6 years earlier. In 1519, a Spanish force under Hernán Cortés landed on the Mexican coast. The Aztec Empire, called the Triple Alliance, governed millions of people from its island capital of Tenochtitlan, built on a lake in central Mexico, one of the largest cities on Earth at that time. A city of maybe 200,000 people, with causeways and aqueducts and markets that left Spanish soldiers literally weeping when they first walked through them. Not from sadness, from the sheer, overwhelming magnificence of the place. Cortés had approximately 600 men. And he absolutely could not have conquered the Aztec Empire with those 600 men. It wasn't possible. No amount of steel or horses or personal courage makes 600 men a match for millions in an empire that functions. He couldn't have done it. That's just math. What he had, what none of them knew he had, what nobody understood yet, was smallpox. In 1520, while Cortés had been temporarily driven out of Tenochtitlan after a disastrous night called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, smallpox arrived in the city. It spread through a population that had zero immunity. Zero. These people had never encountered this virus. Their bodies had no defenses built up over generations of exposure the way European bodies did. Within months, smallpox killed the Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac. It killed generals. It killed administrators. It killed perhaps a third of the city's population. It left the survivors traumatized, leaderless, and locked in a political succession crisis at the precise moment the Spanish regrouped and came back. Cortés didn't conquer a functioning empire. He conquered a civilization that was in the middle of dying. And then he wrote the history books, so it looked like a military triumph. Now, what happened in Mexico in 1520 did not stay in Mexico. The same pathogen that had traveled with Cortés' ships to Vera Cruz, it kept moving. It moved through indigenous trade networks heading south, through Central America, across the Isthmus of Panama. South. The disease was traveling faster than any army had ever moved, along roads it had never been built to cross. How far did it go? And what did it find when it got there? The Inca Empire, at its absolute peak under Huayna Capac, was extraordinary by any standard you want to use. Military, undefeated in living memory across most of its territory. Administrative, a food storage and redistribution system sophisticated enough that nobody in the empire starved when a regional harvest failed. Architectural, stonework so precise, stones fitted together without a single drop of mortar, cut to tolerances that modern engineers still find difficult to fully explain. That the structures have survived 5 centuries of major earthquakes while everything built on top of them by the Spanish has cracked, crumbled, and had to be rebuilt repeatedly. Extraordinary by any measure. But it carried one structural vulnerability that nobody inside it could see, because it had never needed to be seen. The vulnerability had never been tested. The divine authority of the Sahpa Inca was the empire's greatest strength. One man, one source of all legitimate power, no competing institutions, no rival authority that could challenge or check or replace him. Clean, total, absolute. But that same total concentration of authority meant the system had exactly one point of catastrophic failure. If the emperor died without a designated heir, if that divine center was suddenly removed without any preparation, without any designated replacement, there was nothing to fill the vacuum. No council of succession, no constitutional process, no secondary institution that could hold things together while a new center was established. Just two sons, both powerful, both with legitimate claims by different definitions, both already surrounded by their own armies and their own loyal networks, and both, as it turned out, ready to go to war. Sometime between 1524 and 1526, and historians still argue the exact timing, the exact route, the exact sequence, smallpox crossed the Isthmus of Panama. And this part is critical. It did not arrive with Spanish soldiers. Not a single Spanish soldier had yet set eyes on Peru. Not one Spanish ship had sailed far enough down the Pacific coast of South America to make any kind of contact with the Inca world. The Spanish were nowhere near there yet. The disease traveled the way diseases have always traveled throughout human history, invisibly, opportunistically, along the paths of human movement. Indigenous trade networks that had existed for centuries before any European arrived in the Americas. Migration routes. The slow, normal drift of people moving goods from one community to the next, carrying pathogens they didn't know were there in bodies that gave no sign of sickness yet. And the Inca road system. Remember those 25,000 miles of engineered roads, the greatest infrastructure achievement in the pre-Columbian Americas. The system that was the very backbone of the empire became the transmission network. The Chasqui runners who could carry a message 1,500 miles in a week could carry a virus just as fast. Faster, actually, because the virus didn't need a relay station, it just needed a body. The disease moved south through what is now Colombia, down into Ecuador, and up into the high Andes. And everywhere it went, it hit communities that had no previous exposure, no partial immunity built up through generations of encounter, no understanding whatsoever of what was happening to them, or why the people who got sick were dying. By approximately 1524, reports of catastrophic, inexplicable plague were reaching the northern edges of the Inca Empire in what is now Ecuador and Colombia. Entire communities being devastated, people dying faster than they could be buried. By 1525, 1526, the disease had reached the Inca heartland itself. And here is the geography that makes this a tragedy rather than just a disaster. The disease was moving south toward the emperor, and the emperor, unusually, for reasons that had seemed completely reasonable at the time, was already in the north, closer to the pathogen than any Inca had ever been. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was geography doing what geography does. Huayna Capac had spent the last decade, the final decade of what had been an extraordinary reign, governing primarily from Quito, the northernmost major city in the empire, recently conquered, still being consolidated into the imperial structure. This was unusual. Inca emperors traditionally governed from Cusco, the sacred capital, the navel of the world, the city that the Incas believed sat at the literal center of the universe. But the northern campaigns had demanded his personal presence. Quito had needed an emperor nearby to truly become Inca, so Huayna Capac stayed. It was a reasonable decision. It was militarily sensible. It was the kind of pragmatic leadership call that had made him one of the greatest emperors in Inca history. It was also the decision that quietly created two power centers, where there had only ever been one. In the north, Surrounding Huayna in Quito was the army, the most experienced, battle-tested military force in the Inca world, the veterans of a decade of northern campaigns, loyal to the emperor and by proximity and genuine affection built over years, deeply loyal to his son Atahualpa. The young man who had grown up in that northern court, who had watched those campaigns, who had earned his place in those soldiers' respect. In the south, in Koosco, was everything else. The traditional aristocracy, the high priests of Inti, the administrative machinery that had governed the empire for a century, and Huáscar Huayna Kahpac's son by his principal wife, the figure that tradition and legitimacy and the ancient structures of Inca succession pointed toward as the rightful heir. Two power centers, two sons, no designated succession. And the disease was getting closer every single day. Around 1527, and the chronicles give different dates, different accounts. The sources don't perfectly agree. Huayna Capac fell ill in Quito. Fever, skin lesions, rapid deterioration. The symptoms were entirely consistent with smallpox, though no one in that palace had any name for what they were watching, any framework for what it was, any understanding of how it had gotten there or where it was going next. He was not old. He had no reason to be dying. But he was dying. And the disease was not the kind of thing that made exceptions for royalty. It moved through his court simultaneously, hitting the people around him at the same time it was hitting him. His chosen successor, some accounts suggest Huayna Capac had already privately indicated a preference, though he'd never made a formal declaration, died in the same epidemic. Gone. Senior advisors died. Military commanders whose experience and judgment and institutional memory were irreplaceable, dead. The brain trust of the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere was being gutted by something invisible, something that traveled in the air between people, something that had arrived along roads built to carry the empire's authority to its extremities. The irony is almost too much to hold. The roads built the empire. The roads carried the thing that killed it. Huayna Capac knew he was dying. Some accounts recorded decades later, based on testimony from people who were there or who knew people who were there, suggest he tried to name a successor in his final hours. He tried. Did he succeed? The answer to that question is the answer to everything that followed. Huayna Capac died around 1527, in Quito. At the northern edge of the empire he had expanded to its greatest reach. He was the first Shpa Inca, the first emperor of the Inca world, to die of a European disease. He died before meeting a single European. Let that land for a second. He never saw a Spanish soldier. He never heard a cannon fire. He never saw a horse. He never encountered the civilization that would claim credit for destroying his empire. He died of their disease before they arrived, before they were even close. And he died, by most accounts, without formally designating his successor. Some chronicles say he whispered a name at the very end. Others say he fully intended to make the designation, but the disease moved faster than he did. He thought he had more time and he didn't. Others say the designation was made but died with the advisors who witnessed it, those same advisors killed by the same epidemic in the same weeks. What is certain, what every source agrees on is this. When Huayna Capac died, the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere had no emperor and no designated heir. Two sons, both powerful, both supported, both already surrounded by armies. The empire that no external force had ever successfully threatened was about to destroy itself. From the inside. before Pizarro had even left Panama. The emperor is dead. Pizarro is still in Panama. He won't reach Peru for 4 more years. What happens next in those 4 years, before a single Spanish soldier sets foot in the Andes, is the part that most accounts skip right over, the part that gets compressed into a paragraph, or a sentence, or just, and then there was a civil war. It is also the part that explains absolutely everything. The succession crisis that followed Huayna death was not a surprise to anyone paying attention inside the empire. It hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been visible for years in the geography of power, in the way the court had split between north and south, in the fact that 2 sons had been raised in 2 entirely different cities, with 2 entirely different groups of loyalists surrounding them every single day. Huáscar was in Cusco, the traditional capital. He was the son of Huayna principal wife. By Inca royal tradition, that principal wife was his full sister, which sounds strange to modern ears but was standard practice for Inca royalty because it kept the divine bloodline as pure as possible. That lineage made Huáscar, by every traditional Inca succession norm, the legitimate heir. The Cusco aristocracy recognized him. The high priests recognized him. The conservative administrative establishment of the empire, the people who had spent their careers maintaining the traditional structures of how things were supposed to work, they recognized him. Atahualpa was in Quito. He was the son of a secondary wife, possibly a princess from the recently conquered northern territories, though the sources vary on this detail. By strict traditional standards, his claim was weaker than Huáscar's. There's no way around that. But Atahualpa had something Huáscar did not. He had the army. The most experienced, most battle-hardened military force in the entire Inca world. The veterans of Huayna northern campaigns. Men who had spent a decade winning wars in some of the most difficult terrain on earth. They were in Quito, surrounding Atahualpa, loyal to him. And he had 2 generals of such extraordinary military ability that their names are still remembered 500 years later. Quizquiz and Chalcuchimac. Men who had spent decades figuring out how to win wars in high-altitude terrain. Men who understood logistics at a level that would impress a modern military planner. Men who understood the psychology of large armies, how to keep 80,000 soldiers moving, fed, and motivated across thousands of miles of vertical terrain. Huáscar had legitimacy. Atahualpa had the better army. The civil war that followed was, honestly, not really a question. The conflict that historians call the War of the Two Brothers lasted approximately 4 years, from roughly 1527 to 1532. And I want to be real clear about what those 4 years actually looked like, because civil war is a phrase that gets used so casually that it can lose its weight. This was not a border skirmish. It was not a palace coup. It was not a few battles and a political settlement. It was a full-scale war, fought across the entire length of the empire, across mountain passes at 15,000 feet, through river valleys, across high-altitude plains called Puna, from Quito in the north, all the way down to Cusco in the south. 2,500 miles of contested territory. Atahualpa's generals, Quizquiz and Chalcuchimac, proved completely decisive. They ran a campaign of extraordinary military effectiveness, defeating Huáscar's forces in engagement after engagement, moving steadily southward through the empire with a discipline and efficiency that is genuinely impressive even at 500 years of distance. But victory in war costs things beyond the battlefield. Cities changed hands. When cities change hands in a civil war, the populations inside them suffer. Administrative centers were disrupted, and in an empire that ran on administration, disruption cascades fast. The Qolk, the vast network of food storehouses built across the empire to supply armies during campaigns and protect communities during famines, one of the most sophisticated food security systems in the pre-Columbian world, was drawn upon by both sides simultaneously and depleted. The Mita, the labor and population movement system that kept the empire's agricultural infrastructure functioning, that made sure the terraced fields got planted and the irrigation channels got maintained, was disrupted as men were pulled into military service instead. Tens of thousands died in battle across those 4 years. Tens of thousands more died from the cascading disruptions to the agricultural and logistical systems that had kept 12 million people fed for a century. The empire that had functioned with extraordinary efficiency, an efficiency that impressed even the Spanish soldiers who were about to destroy it, was tearing itself apart. And still at this point, Pizarro had not arrived. By early 1532, it was over. Atahualpa's forces had won. Huáscar's armies had been broken in a series of decisive engagements in the terrain around Cusco, the final battles of the Civil War, fought in the heartland of the empire itself. Huáscar was captured, taken alive, brought before Atahualpa's generals, humiliated in the way that only a defeated claimant to a divine throne can truly be humiliated. Atahualpa's forces entered Cusco. And what followed, and this matters, because it directly affects what happens when Pizarro arrives. What followed was not simply a change of government. It was a systematic destruction of Huáscar's entire political base. The royal Huáscar lineage, the Pahnaka, the extended royal family, the court network, the administrators and officials and priests who had built their careers and their loyalty around the legitimate heir in Cusco, was executed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to eliminate any future challenge from that bloodline. Enough to send a message about what Atahualpa was willing to do to consolidate power. Senior officials who had supported Huáscar were removed or killed. The administrative machinery that had run Cusco for a century was disrupted, partially dismantled. The empire had a new emperor. But the empire he had inherited was not the empire his father had ruled. It had been at war with itself for 4 years. Its military was exhausted. Its senior leadership had been partially exterminated. Its administrative systems, the systems that kept 12 million people organized and fed and connected, were fractured. Its food reserves were depleted. Its population had been first traumatized by a catastrophic epidemic that killed their emperor and decimated their leadership, and then by 4 years of civil war that burned cities and pulled men from their fields. And Atahualpa, victorious and weary, took his army north to rest at Cajamarca, a pleasant Inca administrative city with natural hot springs, a good place to let the soldiers recover after 4 years of war. A reasonable choice, a human choice. It was April 1532. 2 months earlier, on the coast far to the west, a group of 168 strangers had come ashore. The roads had carried the disease had killed the emperor's death had started the Civil War. The Civil War had broken the empire, and now the strangers were marching inland. The chain was complete. Every single link had been forged before Pizarro climbed a single mountain pass. Now Francisco Pizarro was not a man who got things right on the first try. He was born illegitimate in the city of Trujillo in the Spanish region of Extremadura, the son of a minor military officer and a woman the officer never married. He was illiterate his entire life, could not read, could not write, signed documents with a mark. He had no formal military training, no noble connections that counted for much, no obvious path toward wealth, recognition, or anything resembling a legacy. What he had was something that is genuinely hard to overstate in its importance to what follows. He was persistent in a way that bordered on pathological. His first expedition south from Panama in 1524 failed completely. Disease tore through his men on the Colombian coast. Hostile local populations pushed back hard. The supplies ran out. He turned back. His second expedition in 1526, 1527, that one went further, far enough down the Pacific coast to actually reach the edges of northern Peru, far enough to capture a large balsa trading raft carrying gold objects and silver and fine woven cloth, and a man who spoke a language none of them had heard before, far enough to understand in his bones that the stories were true. There was a great civilization to the south. It was real. It was wealthy beyond what he had dared to fully imagine. But he was ordered back to Panama. His men were sick and dying. The governor of Panama, Pedro de los Ariesos, refused to keep supporting what looked like an expensive, lethal, and increasingly pointless expedition. And it was on the return, on a small island off the Colombian coast called Gallo, that Pizarro did the single most important thing of his entire life. He drew a line in the sand. Literally, a line in the sand on the beach, drawn with his sword. On one side of that line, return to Panama, safety, food, failure, go back, report failure, and let someone else find the empire or let it stay unfound. On the other side, continue south, into the unknown, toward wealth or toward death with no guarantee of which one was waiting. He invited any man willing to cross that line to join him. 13 men crossed. Just 13. The famous 13, they're called in the chronicles. They crossed that line, stayed with Pizarro, eventually reached the northern coast of Peru, saw the cities, confirmed the gold, and then returned to Panama to prepare for what would become the real expedition. In 1528, Pizarro sailed all the way back to Spain to petition King Charles I directly, because he'd learned that if you want a yes, you have to go to the person with the actual power to say it. In 1529, the king said yes. The document was called the Capitulación de Toledo, a royal contract. It named Pizarro governor and captain general of the territory to be conquered. It specified his share of whatever wealth came out of it. It authorized him to make war. Spain had given one illiterate, illegitimate, twice-failed adventurer from Extremadura permission to conquer whatever he found south of Panama. The force that Pizarro assembled for his third and final expedition was, by any conventional military analysis, absurd. 168 soldiers, 67 horses, 3 small cannons. These were not professional soldiers in any modern sense of that phrase. They were adventurers and criminals and men with gambling debts and men who had done something back home they needed to get very far away from. They were minor nobility who'd run out of opportunities in Spain and needed a long shot to work. Men with everything to gain, and for most of them, genuinely nothing to lose. Many had fought in the Caribbean campaigns. Some had marched with Cortés in Mexico. Most had no real idea what exactly they were walking into. What they had, and this is the biological reality that makes the entire conquest story make sense. What they had was immunity. They had grown up in a world where smallpox was endemic, where it circulated through European populations repeatedly, killing some people and leaving survivors with acquired resistance, where children who survived childhood sickness carried immunological memory that protected them from the worst of future exposure. The people they were about to encounter had none of that. None. Zero immunological defense against a virus their ancestors had never faced in the history of their civilization. The disease had already gone ahead of Pizarro's force. It had already traveled those 25,000 miles of Inca roads. It had already killed the emperor. It had already started the civil war. It had already done, over 5 years, invisibly, what no invading army could have done. When Pizarro's force landed on the Peruvian coast in January 1531, they were not walking into an intact empire at the height of its power. They were walking into a graveyard that was still breathing. Pizarro is on the coast. Atahualpa is at Cajamarca with 80,000 soldiers. Everything still looks impossible on paper. 168 against 80,000. No serious military analyst in the world would give Pizarro a fighting chance. But the empire those 80,000 soldiers serve has already been broken. The succession is already gone. The civil war is over, but its wounds are not closed, not even close. What happens next is the part everyone knows. But now you're going to see it completely differently. In September 1532, Pizarro left his small coastal settlement of San Miguel de Piora and began marching his force inland toward Cajamarca. 168 men, into the Andes, toward an army of 80,000. The march took them through some of the most challenging terrain on the planet. The Inca road, wide, stone-paved, with rest stations called tambos positioned every few miles, was remarkable. Even Pizarro's soldiers, men who had crossed oceans and survived Caribbean campaigns, acknowledged it. But the altitude was something else entirely. The passes they had to cross reached 14,000, 15,000 feet above sea level. The air at that altitude is thin enough to make your heart work noticeably harder just standing still, on a horse, in full armor, climbing. The temperature dropped below freezing every night. And the entire way, every single day of that march, they could see the fires of Atahualpa's army on the hillsides around them. Tens of thousands of soldiers, camped across the mountains, watching 168 men walk directly toward them. Let me paint that picture clearly. You are one of those 168 men. Every night you look out at the surrounding mountains and you can count the campfires of an army that outnumbers your entire force by a ratio of almost 500 to 1. You can see the smoke during the day. You can see the glow at night. You know they can see you. Pizarro's men were scared. The chronicles are honest about this. Some accounts describe moments that were very close to outright mutiny. Men arguing that the whole enterprise was insane, that turning back was the only rational choice, that no amount of gold was worth marching into this. Pizarro kept moving. What nobody in that march could fully appreciate, because they didn't have the information to appreciate it, was why those 80,000 soldiers on the hillsides were not attacking them. Atahualpa had scouts. He had known exactly where they were since they landed. He knew how many there were. He knew about the horses and the metal clothing and the strange weapons that made noise like thunder. He had been receiving detailed intelligence reports for months. He chose not to attack. Not out of fear. He had 80,000 soldiers. What did he have to fear from 168 strangers? Not out of ignorance. He knew precisely where they were at every moment. Out of curiosity, and out of a confidence so total, so absolute, so justified by every experience of his entire life. He had just won a 4-year civil war, for crying out loud that it had become a blind spot he couldn't see around. 168 men were not a threat. They were a curiosity, maybe useful, maybe interesting, definitely manageable. Atahualpa had multiple clear opportunities to destroy Pizarro's force while they were at their most vulnerable, strung out in narrow mountain passes, gasping at altitude, far from any possible reinforcement. He declined every one of those opportunities. Why, and what exactly did that decision cost him? On November the 15th, 1532, Pizarro's force arrived at Cajamarca. The city was empty, abandoned, quiet, its plazas and administrative buildings sitting silent. Atahualpa had his entire army camped in the fields and on the hillsides outside the city walls. The Spanish walked in and found themselves in a deserted Inca city with 80,000 soldiers visible on every surrounding hillside. Pizarro sent 2 men to meet the emperor directly, his own brother, Hernando Pizarro, and a captain named Hernando de Soto, a man with a reputation for personal courage that, depending on how you look at it, could also be described as a profound recklessness. De Soto rode his horse directly into Atahualpa's presence. Then, and this was almost certainly a deliberate, calculated demonstration of what this animal could do, he charged his horse at full gallop directly at the Inca emperor. Not at his guards, not at the surrounding retinue, at the emperor himself, pulling up so close so suddenly that the horse's hot breath reportedly moved the royal fringe, the tassel of fine wool that only the Shpa Inca was permitted to wear on his forehead, the symbol of his divine authority. Atahualpa did not flinch. Not a muscle moved, not a blink, not a single involuntary recoil from a huge, strange, fast-moving animal stopping inches from his face. He had never seen a horse in his life. The Inca world had no horses, no large domesticated animals that could be ridden, nothing remotely analogous to what De Soto had just done. This was the first time Atahualpa had ever been within arm's reach of one. And he sat completely still. The chronicles record that afterward, after De Soto and Hernando Pizarro had returned to the Spanish position, Atahualpa ordered the execution of any soldiers in his retinue who had stepped back from the charging horse. In Inca military culture and court protocol, flinching in the presence of the emperor was considered deeply unacceptable. But the order reveals something more important than protocol. It reveals that Atahualpa was performing confidence, not just feeling it, but actively performing it. For his army watching from the hillsides, for himself, for whatever intelligence he was still gathering about these 168 strangers who had walked through his mountains. He invited the Spanish to meet him the following day in Cajamarca's central plaza. He would bring his attendants, unarmed or lightly armed, as a deliberate show of peaceful dominance. He was so powerful he didn't need to bring weapons to a meeting with 168 strangers. He had 80,000 soldiers 50 yards away. What could go wrong? The night of November the 15th, 1532, inside the walls of Cajamarca, Pizarro's 168 men prepared for what they knew was going to happen the next day. They weren't preparing for a battle in any conventional sense. There was no conventional battle possible. The numbers made it impossible. They were preparing for an ambush, a complete, total, overwhelming surprise attack against a diplomatic meeting. Pizarro positioned his cavalry in the buildings and along the walls surrounding the central plaza, the plaza where Atahualpa would be arriving tomorrow. The three small cannons were aimed directly at the plaza entrance. The infantry was hidden in the shadows along the walls. The plan was straightforward. When a specific signal was given, every single person attacked simultaneously. Cavalry charges from multiple directions at once. Cannon fire into the crowd. Infantry on foot. Total, immediate, overwhelming chaos. The signal would come when the moment was right. But which moment, what sign? Pizarro asked the friar, Vicente de Valverde, the Dominican priest who was part of the expedition, to go out first, to approach Atahualpa, to read him the requerimiento, the legal document, originally written in 1513, that the Spanish used throughout the conquest of the Americas. The document that required indigenous rulers to formally acknowledge the authority of the Pope, the sovereignty of the King of Spain, and the truth of the Christian faith. And to hand the emperor a Bible. Whatever happened with the Bible, that would be the moment. In the buildings around that empty plaza, 168 men waited in the dark. The chronicles, with unusual honesty, record that many of them urinated from fear. Just standing there, waiting, they could see the glow of 80,000 campfires on the hillsides around the city. They could hear, or imagined they could hear, the sounds of an army that outnumbered them 476 to 1. And they waited. Curiosity Loop 2, answer. The disease had traveled 3,000 miles south. The emperor had died. The civil war had broken the empire's spine. And now, in a cold plaza in a deserted Inca city in the Andes, the very last thread of what might have been a different history was about to be cut. By a Bible. November the 16th, 1532. Atahualpa entered the plaza of Cajamarca in the afternoon. He was carried on a golden litter palanquin by 80 lords dressed in matching blue livery. Around him and the litter moved several thousand attendants and nobles, unarmed, or so lightly armed that the distinction barely mattered. His full army, 80,000 soldiers, remained outside the city walls as he had planned. A deliberate choice, a statement of power through restraint. He was a god king, receiving foreign curiosities. He didn't need his army for this. Friar Vicente de Valverde walked out into the plaza to meet him. He carried a Bible in one hand and a cross in the other. Through an interpreter, a young man named Felipe Wamon, also called Felipillo in the Spanish chronicles, an indigenous youth who had been taken from the coast during Pizarro's earlier expeditions and taught Spanish, de Valverde delivered the requerimiento, the legal document requiring Atahualpa to acknowledge the authority of the Pope, the sovereignty of the King of Spain, the truth of the Christian faith. Read in Spanish to an emperor who spoke Quechua. Even through the interpreter, even with the best possible translation, what was being said must have been incomprehensible in its arrogance. A stranger in metal clothing, standing in Atahualpa's own city, in the plaza of an Inca administrative center, was telling the son of the sun god, the divine ruler of 12 million people, the man who had just won a 4-year civil war, that he owed allegiance to a distant king he had never heard of, and a deity whose existence he had no reason to consider. Atahualpa asked to see the Bible. De Valverde handed it to him. Atahualpa held it, turned it over, examined it the way any intelligent person examines an unfamiliar object. Then, according to the eyewitness account of Francisco de Hierro, Pizarro's personal secretary, who was standing in those buildings watching. He held it to his ear. He heard nothing. He threw it to the ground. De Valverde ran. Back toward the buildings. Back toward Pizarro. And as he ran, he shouted, and multiple Spanish chroniclers recorded versions of these words with variations, but the substance is consistent. Come out, Christians. Come at these enemy dogs who reject the things of God. That chief has thrown my book of holy law to the ground. Did you not see what happened? Why remain polite and servile toward this overproud dog when the fields are full of Indians? March out against him, for I absolve you. Pizarro gave the signal. The cannons fired directly into the crowd. The cavalry burst simultaneously from the buildings on all sides of the plaza. 168 men attacked several thousand unarmed attendants in an enclosed stone plaza. What happened next lasted approximately 2 hours. It was not a battle. A battle requires two sides capable of fighting each other. What happened in that plaza was not that. The Inca attendants packed into the plaza were unarmed or so lightly armed they might as well have been. They were pressed tightly together in an enclosed space with stone walls on all sides. The cannon fire, at close range, into a dense crowd, created immediate, total panic. The cavalry, horses moving at full speed in multiple directions simultaneously, steel swords swinging, cut through the panicking crowd with devastating and one-sided effect. There was nowhere to run. The press of bodies against the plaza walls became so intense, thousands of people trying to push through solid stone, that one entire section of wall collapsed outward under the weight of the crowd. People poured through the gap and ran for the surrounding fields. The soldiers outside the city, 80,000 of them, still armed, still organized, still absolutely capable of overwhelming 168 men in the time it takes to run 50 yards, did not attack. They could hear the cannons, sound like nothing they had ever heard, explosions that carried across the mountains. They could hear the screaming from inside the city. They could see the smoke rising above the walls. And they stood on the hillside, and they did not move. Because their emperor was inside. Attacking might kill him. And in an empire built entirely and completely around the divine authority of the Smallpox Inca, in an empire where every soldier's legitimacy, every general's authority, every command structure derived from one man, the army could not act without imperial command. The army that could have ended Pizarro's expedition in 5 minutes stood paralyzed on a hillside, while their emperor was captured 40 yards away. Pizarro himself, and this detail says something about the man, fought through his own soldiers to reach Atahualpa's litter, fought through the chaos of his own men trying to reach the same target, cut down the lords holding the litter on their shoulders, lords who maintained their grip on the carrying poles even as they were cut down, because releasing the Smallpox Inca to the ground was an unthinkable act of disrespect. He caught Atahualpa as the litter finally tipped. He was the only Spanish soldier wounded in the entire engagement. Cut on the hand by his own men in the scramble to reach the emperor. When it stopped, 6,000 to 7,000 Inca dead. 0 Spanish dead. Atahualpa in chains. The largest empire in the Western Hemisphere had lost its emperor in approximately 2 hours to 168 men in an enclosed plaza in the Andes. Atahualpa is a prisoner. 80,000 soldiers are on the hillside outside Cajamarca. They could still destroy Pizarro's force. The math is still impossible. 168 against 80,000. Nothing about those numbers has changed. But the empire was built around one man. And that man is in chains. What happens next reveals something about the nature of power that is just as true today as it was in 1532. The cost, the catastrophic, irreversible cost, of building everything around a single point of failure. In the hours and days immediately following Cajamarca, Pizarro's most dangerous vulnerability was also, paradoxically, his greatest strategic asset. The Inca army, 80,000 soldiers, still completely intact, still armed, still capable of overwhelming 168 men without breaking a sweat, did nothing. And I want to be precise here, because this is often misread. It was not cowardice. These were the same soldiers who had just won a 4-year civil war against a large and experienced opposing army. They were not cowards. It was not disorganization. The army of Atahualpa was one of the most effectively organized military forces in the Americas. Quizquiz and Chalcuchimac, the two commanding generals, were brilliant and experienced. It was theology. The Sahpa Inca was a god. His person was sacred in a way that went beyond any metaphor Western readers might reach for. His commands were divine law, not just authority, divine law. The entire army's purpose, its legitimacy, its complete command structure flowed from him and only from him. Quizquiz was in the field with a large force. Chalcuchimac was in the field with a large force. Either of them alone commanded enough soldiers to simply walk over the Spanish position and end the whole thing. Together, the question would have been over in minutes. They waited for orders from Atahualpa. And Atahualpa, from inside a small room in an Inca building in Cajamarca, with a Spanish garrison positioned outside, gave orders. Because he still believed he could manage this. He had been captured. He was physically a prisoner, but he was still the Sahpa Inca. He was still the divine center of the imperial system. He was still the emperor, and the empire still responded to his commands. He was still issuing orders through the Chasqui relay system, still maintaining administrative contact with the governors and generals across the empire. He would negotiate. He would demonstrate his wealth, a wealth these strangers clearly had no concept of. He would make them understand what they had actually taken and what they could gain by being reasonable about it. He had a plan. The plan was, by any standard, audacious. Atahualpa looked at the room where he was being held, a room the Spanish chronicles describe as approximately 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, and he made Francisco Pizarro an offer. He would fill that room with gold, not sprinkle it, not partially fill it, fill it. He stood up, reached as high as he could toward the wall approximately 8 feet off the ground and marked a line, to there. Then he would fill 2 additional adjacent rooms with silver. In exchange for his freedom. Pizarro agreed. The agreement was written down. Witnesses from both sides signed it. The most extraordinary ransom negotiation in human history was formalized in a small room in the Andes Mountains. And the gold began to come. From every corner of the empire, from temples in Kiosko, from royal palaces in Quito, from sacred storehouses accumulated over a century of imperial expansion and tribute collection, gold objects began arriving in Cajamarca. Golden statues of the gods, golden vessels used in religious ceremonies, massive golden panels stripped carefully from the walls of temples where they had represented the rays of the sun. The great golden disk, a representation of Inti, the sun god himself, removed from the Ko-Rikayan Cha, the temple of the sun in Kiosko, the most sacred site in the entire Inca world, and carried hundreds of miles north on men's backs. It took 8 months. When it was complete, when the gold and silver had been counted and assessed, the room held approximately 13,000 pounds of gold objects. The adjacent rooms held approximately 26,000 pounds of silver, 13,000 pounds of gold, 26,000 pounds of silver. Objects of extraordinary artistic and cultural significance accumulated over centuries of Inca civilization, representing the aesthetic and spiritual achievement of a 12 million person empire, were melted down, melted into ingots, weighed and divided. Divided among 168 men, each soldier's share represented more wealth than most Europeans could expect to earn in multiple lifetimes. The ransom was paid, completely, in full. Every object Atahualpa had promised was delivered. Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. During the months of his captivity, Atahualpa continued to govern the empire from that small room in Cajamarca, issuing commands through the imperial messenger system, maintaining as much control as a captive emperor could maintain. He also gave one order from that captivity that would directly accelerate his own death. Huáscar, his brother, his defeated rival, the man whose legitimate claim to the throne had been the foundation of the Civil War, had been held as a prisoner in the south since his capture, and he was reportedly communicating with the Spanish. The exact nature of those communications is disputed in the sources, but what Atahualpa understood correctly was the threat. If Pizarro chose to release Huáscar, use him as a puppet emperor, govern the empire through him rather than through a hostile Atahualpa, the Spanish would have an enormously powerful political tool. So Atahualpa ordered Huáscar's execution. The order was carried out. Huáscar was killed before Pizarro could use him. But the execution had consequences Atahualpa hadn't fully calculated. It demonstrated to the Spanish something they had perhaps only suspected before, that Atahualpa was still fully capable of exercising imperial authority from captivity. That keeping him alive meant the empire would continue to operate through him, continue to be a source of organized potential resistance, continue to present the possibility of a coordinated response. A living Atahualpa was a problem that didn't go away just because he was in a room. The arguments for his execution began gaining serious weight in Pizarro's inner councils. In July 1533, the ransom was declared complete. The gold and silver were melted down and the ingots divided. And then Pizarro convened what he formally described as a trial. Atahualpa was charged with 12 separate offenses: idolatry, polygamy, squandering royal treasure, the murder of Huáscar. Now, let's be straight about what these charges actually were. The charge of idolatry meant that Atahualpa practiced the Inca religion, which he did. He was the Shpa Inca. The religious role of the emperor was inseparable from the political one. Charging him with idolatry was charging him with being who he was. The charge of polygamy meant he had multiple wives, which he did, which every Inca emperor had, which was a foundational feature of Inca royal custom, not a crime by any standard Atahualpa had grown up with. The charge of squandering royal treasure was, by any honest reading, absurd. He had offered his ransom voluntarily as a negotiated exchange. The murder of Huáscar was real, but Huáscar was a military opponent in a civil war, not a civilian victim of unprovoked violence. The trial was a formality. The verdict had been decided before the charges were read. Everyone in that room knew it. Atahualpa was condemned to death by burning. And this is where you understand something important about what he believed and who he was. In Inca spiritual belief, burning the physical body was not simply death. It was a catastrophe beyond death. It destroyed the physical vessel that the person's spirit would need in the afterlife. It prevented mummification, which was the sacred practice by which deceased Inca emperors continued to exist and be consulted and honored for generations after their physical death. Burning didn't just kill you, it erased you from the spiritual world entirely. When Atahualpa learned the method of execution, he made one final negotiation. He would convert to Christianity. In exchange, the method would be changed from burning to garroting, strangulation. His body would remain intact. He took the Christian name, Juan Santos Atahualpa, at his baptism. The chronicles, multiple witnesses, both Spanish and those recording Inca testimony, note that he accepted the conversion calmly, without visible fear, without any outward sign of despair. Multiple witnesses recorded it. They found it remarkable enough to write down. On August the 29th, 1533, in the plaza of Cajamarca, the same plaza where 6,000 of his attendants had been killed 9 months before, Atahualpa was brought out to be executed. The chronicles describe thousands of his followers present, weeping, open, sustained weeping that the Spanish soldiers found unsettling. This was not a population that had been cowed into silence. Some accounts describe women attempting to throw themselves into the fires that had been prepared for the original burning sentence, following the Inca practice of accompanying their lord into death. Atahualpa was seated in a chair in the center of the plaza. The garrote was placed around his neck. His exact final words are not recorded. The chronicles don't give us a quotable last statement, a final declaration. That silence in the historical record is itself a kind of weight. What is recorded is that he was calm. He had paid the largest ransom in human history, 13,000 pounds of gold, 26,000 pounds of silver. Every object he had promised delivered. He had converted to a religion he had never heard of 3 weeks before his execution. He had spent 9 months in captivity issuing commands, maintaining as much dignity as a god-king in a small room could maintain, apparently still believing until near the end that the situation could be managed, that the negotiation would work, that the ransom agreement would be honored. He was calm, and he was strangled. In Pizarro's camp, 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver sat in ingots, already divided, already inventoried, already being loaded for transport north. The gold was gone. The room was empty. The last emperor of a functioning Inca world was dead. Atahualpa is dead. The ransom is gone. The empire has no emperor again. For the second time in 5 years, the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere has no Inca. But the Inca world does not simply stop. Civilizations don't just stop. The roads are still there. The cities are still there. 12 million people are still there, still alive, still going about their lives on those terraced hillsides and in those mountain cities. What happens next, the resistance, the attempts to hold something together, the final end, takes another 40 years. In some ways, the worst is still ahead. November 1533. 4 months after Atahualpa's execution in that plaza in Cajamarca. 4 months since the gold was melted and the ransom divided, and the last emperor of a functioning Inca world was strangled in a chair. Pizarro's force, now reinforced. More Spanish soldiers had been arriving from Panama, drawn by the news of what had happened at Cajamarca, by the stories of gold beyond anything anyone had imagined. The force that had been 168 was now significantly larger, and it was accompanied by something the Spanish would rely on throughout the conquest of the Americas: indigenous allies. Thousands of them. Men from groups that had suffered under Inca imperial rule for generations, who saw in the Spanish not conquerors but potential liberators from an empire they had never consented to join. Men who knew the terrain, knew the roads, knew which passes were defensible and which weren't, and who had their own scores to settle. This combined force began marching south, toward Kosco, toward the navel of the world. The Inca generals Quizquiz and Chalcuchimac were still in the field. Both still commanded significant forces. Both were still, on paper, capable of making the road to Kosco enormously costly for the Spanish and their allies. They did not. Or rather, they could not effectively, not in the way they might have if the system they served still had its center. Chalcuchimac had been captured by Hernando Pizarro at the time of Cajamarca, tricked into meeting under what amounted to a false promise of safe conduct, then seized. He was traveling with Pizarro's column right now, a prisoner moving south toward his own capital in chains. One of the two greatest military minds in the Inca world, gone from the field before the march to Kosco even began. Quizquiz was still free. He fought a retreating action north of Kosco, harassing the Spanish column, trying to slow the advance, trying to do something with the forces he still commanded. But his own soldiers, men who had spent 4 years winning a civil war, men who were exhausted and demoralized and deeply uncertain about who they were fighting for now that the emperor was dead, men who had watched everything they understood about authority and divine order collapse in the space of 9 months, began to desert. Not in ones and twos, in significant numbers. Soldiers leaving the field not because they were cowards, but because the system that had given their service meaning had ceased to exist. The army of Atahualpa, the army that had marched the full length of the empire and never lost, was dissolving. Not because it had been beaten in battle. Because the center it served was gone, and without a center, an empire is just geography. In November 1533, Francisco Pizarro entered Kosco. Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's cousin, a young man who had been part of the expedition since Panama and who would later write one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of the entire conquest, recorded what he saw when they entered the city. He wrote, and I'm giving you the substance of his account here. We found it so magnificent that no tongue could fully describe it. It seemed to us like things of enchantment, and some of our soldiers asked whether the things they saw were not a dream. Not a dream. Kosco at the moment of Spanish entry was still largely intact. The Civil War had damaged it. Atahualpa's forces had entered the city after Huáscar's defeat and done their own share of disruption. Some of its religious sites had been stripped of gold to feed the ransom, but the fundamental physical structure of the city remained. And it was extraordinary. We are talking about a city of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, at a moment in history when London had approximately 60,000 people, and most European cities outside Paris and Constantinople were far smaller. A city built at 11,000 feet above sea level, in the Andes Mountains, with streets paved in stone and water channels running through the city carrying clean water from mountain springs. Royal palaces that occupied entire city blocks. Temple complexes that covered acres. And at the center of it, the Inca, the Temple of the Sun, the most sacred site in the entire Inca world. Its walls had been covered in sheets of hammered gold representing the rays of Inti, most of that gold already stripped and sent north as part of the ransom. But the structure itself, the foundations, the massive fitted stones, each one cut and placed with a precision that Spanish stonemasons, professional builders, men who understood construction, could not comprehend. Pizarro installed Machenko Inca, a younger son of Huayna Capac, who had survived Atahualpa's purge of the Huáscar bloodline through a combination of luck, youth, and obscurity, as a puppet emperor. A Sahpa Inca in title, subordinate to Spanish authority in every practical sense. It was a useful fiction for both sides, at least initially. The Spanish needed the appearance of Inca legitimacy to govern an empire of 12 million people with a force that was still, even reinforced, tiny. Machenko Inca needed something the Spanish didn't yet understand he needed. Time. What followed the entry into Osco was systematic cultural destruction, dressed up as colonial administration. The Spanish moved through the city's temples and royal palaces with a thoroughness that left nothing of portable value untouched. The Inca was stripped of everything that remained after the ransom. The garden of the temple, described in multiple chronicles as containing life-size replicas of plants, animals, and human figures rendered entirely in gold and silver, accumulated over a century of Inca imperial wealth and artistic achievement, was dismantled piece by piece. Golden ears of corn, each kernel individually rendered, silver llamas, gold butterflies with wings of hammered metal so fine they could move in a breeze, objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, representing the accumulated artistic genius of a civilization, objects that no amount of money could ever replace or recreate, because the knowledge and the tradition that produced them was about to be destroyed along with everything else. All of it was melted. The royal mummies, the preserved bodies of previous Inca emperors, maintained in their palace apartments with their full household of servants still attending them, still consulted on matters of state in Inca spiritual practice, still treated as present and active participants in the governance of the empire even in death, were seized. Some were eventually handed to the Spanish Inquisition, which declared them objects of idolatry and had them burned. The Quipioo, the knotted string records that served as the Inca administrative data system, encoding census information, tax records, historical accounts, astronomical observations, agricultural data, in a medium that was sophisticated, functional, and completely unlike anything European scholars had ever seen, were largely destroyed or simply lost, discarded as incomprehensible curiosities by people who couldn't read them and didn't try to learn. An entire civilization's accumulated knowledge, the memory of a 12 million person empire, gone. What could not be melted or burned, the Spanish built over. The Santo Domingo Church in Osco was constructed directly on top of the Inca's foundations. The Inca stonework was too precise, too massive, too well fitted to demolish with 16th century tools. So they built on top of it, incorporated Inca walls into a Christian church, Inca stones supporting a Spanish altar. The navel of the world became a Spanish colonial city. And it happened in the space of a few years. Machenko Inca watched all of this. He was approximately 18 years old when Pizarro installed him as puppet emperor. A teenager, essentially, given the title of the most powerful position in the Western Hemisphere, and stripped of every actual power that title had ever carried. He had survived Atahualpa's purge of the Huáscar bloodline through youth and obscurity. He simply hadn't been considered important enough to execute. He had initially welcomed the Spanish presence, or at least accepted it, possibly genuinely seeing them as liberators from the forces that had just killed most of his family. Maybe he believed in those first months that the arrangement was manageable. It was not manageable. The Spanish treated him with a contempt that grew in direct proportion to their confidence in their own position. His wives were taken, seized by Spanish soldiers who faced no consequence for doing so. His personal possessions were confiscated. On at least one occasion, he was physically imprisoned when he showed any sign of attempting to exercise actual independent authority. He was given the title and the ceremonial robes of the Smallpox Inca. He was given nothing else. For approximately 2 years, Smallpox Inca played the role he had been assigned. He performed the ceremonies. He appeared in public in the regalia of the emperor. He gave the Spanish the appearance of Inca legitimacy they needed to maintain their grip on a resentful population. And quietly, carefully, through channels the Spanish didn't understand and couldn't monitor, he sent messages. He maintained contact with Inca military commanders who had not been captured. He sent instructions through the Quipo relay system to people across the empire who were watching and waiting. He was planning something. And the Spanish, wealthy now beyond anything they had dreamed of when they left Panama, confident to the point of carelessness in their military superiority, contemptuous of a population they considered thoroughly conquered, did not see it coming. In early 1536, approximately 2.5 years after the Spanish entered Kosco, Smallpox Inca made his move. He asked the Spanish for permission to leave the city temporarily. The reason he gave was religious, a ceremony that needed to be conducted at a sacred site outside Kosco. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a golden statue of his father Huayna Capac was hidden somewhere nearby, and that he needed to retrieve it. An offering of additional gold, essentially. An incentive. The Spanish were skeptical. They had learned over 2 years to be cautious about the puppet emperor's movements. They refused initially. Smallpox Inca escalated. He offered hostages, members of his own household who would remain in Kosco as guarantors of his return. He offered additional valuables. He was persistent and patient and completely convincing. He was eventually given permission to leave the city, accompanied by a small Spanish escort to ensure his return. He did not return. The moment he was outside Spanish direct control, the performance ended. Messages had already been sent weeks, possibly months before. Commanders in every region of the empire had already received instructions. Armies had already been quietly assembled in the surrounding mountains, in valleys and passes where Spanish patrols didn't reach, waiting for the signal. By the time the Spanish garrison in Kosco understood what was happening, Smallpox Inca was already at the head of an army. The chronicles give different numbers. Different Spanish accounts say different things, and Inca accounts give their own figures. But whether the number was 100,000 or 200,000 or something in between, what is certain is that it was the largest indigenous military force assembled anywhere in the Americas since the Spanish conquest had begun. And it was marching on Kosco. The siege of Kosco began in April or May of 1536. The Spanish garrison inside the city at the time of the siege's outbreak numbered fewer than 200 soldiers. Not the full force. Many were scattered across the empire in other positions, in Lima on the coast, in smaller outposts. The core of what the Spanish had available to defend Cusco was under 200 men against an army that surrounded the city completely in every direction. Inca's forces used fire. They attached burning material, grass, fabric, whatever would hold a flame, to sling stones and launched them in high arcs onto the thatched roofs of Spanish-occupied buildings. Cusco burned. Not the stone structures, the stone didn't burn, but everything built on top of Inca foundations by the Spanish, everything with a thatched roof, the accumulated construction of 2 years of colonial occupation, it burned. They cut off the water supply. They controlled every road in and out of the city. Nothing moved in or out of Cusco without Inca's permission. They also attacked Sacsayhuaman, the massive Inca military fortress sitting on the hillside directly above Cusco, built with individual stones weighing up to 100 tons, fitted without mortar in the characteristic Inca style. A structure so massive that Spanish soldiers genuinely could not understand how it had been constructed by human beings without iron tools or wheeled machinery. The Spanish had occupied Sacsayhuaman and used it as a defensive position. Inca's forces attacked it directly. The fighting for the fortress was the most intense combat of the entire siege. Inca forces temporarily retook parts of it, and the battle went back and forth across those massive stone walls and terraces. It was here that Juan Pizarro, Francisco's younger brother, one of the more capable members of the Pizarro family, was killed, struck by a stone during an assault on the fortress walls. The chronicles say he was struck on the head, that the wound was fatal, that he died shortly after. He was reportedly in his early 20s. For the Spanish inside Cusco, the situation was genuinely, truly desperate in a way that the comfortable distance of history sometimes makes it hard to feel. They were outnumbered by a factor of 500 or more. They were running low on supplies. Multiple requests for reinforcement sent south to Lima went unanswered initially. And then the relief forces that were eventually sent were ambushed on the roads by Inca forces before they could reach the city. A relief column of approximately 70 Spanish soldiers, well-armed, experienced men, was wiped out almost entirely in the Inca mountain ambushes. 70 men gone. And simultaneously, 500 miles to the north, an equally massive Inca force was laying siege to Lima itself, the new Spanish coastal city, Pizarro's own capital. Inca's rebellion was, for a period of months, genuinely working. The Great Rebellion came closer to ending Spanish power in Peru than any version of the conquest story written by the victors will fully acknowledge. For the better part of a year, the Spanish position in Cusco was genuinely precarious. Not difficult precarious. Genuinely, they might lose this precarious. The garrison held, but holding was all they were doing. They survived through the defensive advantage of massive stone buildings that couldn't be burned, through the effectiveness of horses in the narrow streets of the city against massed infantry, trying to advance without the benefit of cover, and through the kind of desperate, cornered animal ferocity that tends to produce remarkable individual acts of combat effectiveness. But several factors worked against Inca's ultimate success, and they compounded each other. The first was logistics. The Inca military tradition was built for campaigns, for moving large armies across long distances, engaging enemy forces in the field, winning decisive battles, and then withdrawing. It was not built for extended siege warfare. Keeping hundreds of thousands of soldiers fed, supplied, and coherent in a sustained position around a single city for months required logistical resources. And those resources came from the same food storage and agricultural systems that the Civil War had already depleted, and that were now being further strained. The second was political fragility. Inca's rebellion was the largest indigenous military response to Spanish conquest in the history of the Americas. But it was not perfectly unified. Groups that had suffered under Inca imperial expansion, communities that had been forcibly incorporated into Tahuantinsoou against their will, groups like the Nairi in the north, who had aligned with the Spanish during the conquest, chose to support the Spanish rather than fight alongside the Incas. Old resentments against imperial authority didn't disappear just because the Incas were now fighting the Spanish. And then there were the horses. In open terrain, in the fields and plains outside Cusco, the Inca forces had no effective answer to Spanish cavalry charges. The psychological impact of horses in combat had not diminished. Infantry packed together is devastatingly vulnerable to cavalry, and the Inca forces had no horses of their own and no time to develop the specific counter-tactics that eventually, over generations, other indigenous groups would work out. By early 1537, the siege was breaking down. Not because Inca had been defeated in a decisive engagement, because the planting season had arrived. The men who made up this army were also farmers. They had communities, families, fields that needed to be planted if there was going to be food next year. An army that lives off the land cannot stay in the field indefinitely, not when the land itself needs tending. Inca pulled back. Not in defeat, in tactical withdrawal. He was going somewhere the Spanish cavalry could not follow. Inca withdrew into the jungle-covered mountains northeast of Cusco, a region called Vilcabamba. The choice was deliberate and strategically brilliant in a way that the Spanish, initially, completely failed to appreciate. The terrain was unlike anything in the Andean highlands. Deep river valleys choked with tropical vegetation, dense jungle where the canopy closes above you and the undergrowth below you is impenetrable without local knowledge of where the paths are. Altitude changes of thousands of feet within distances of a few miles, from highland cold to jungle heat in an afternoon's walk, if you knew which trails to take. Spanish cavalry, the decisive military technology that had made the conquest possible, that had been the psychological and tactical trump card at Cajamarca and Cusco, and every major engagement, was useless in that terrain. Heavy metal armor in jungle heat is a liability, not an advantage. Supply lines across that landscape were essentially impossible to maintain. And without local knowledge, the trails simply didn't exist. You couldn't find them, which meant you couldn't navigate, which meant any expedition into Vilcabamba was walking into terrain where Inca held every advantage. He established a new capital deep in the jungle. He maintained the rituals, the administrative forms, the court protocol of the Inca Empire. He continued to regard himself as the legitimate Inca because he was, not a puppet, the real one, the last one. He launched periodic raids against Spanish settlements in the Andes, sometimes striking quickly, causing real damage, and withdrawing back into the jungle before the Spanish could mount an effective response. The Spanish launched 3 major military expeditions into Vilcabamba during Inca's lifetime. Expeditions with experienced soldiers, indigenous guides, specific intelligence about where he was. All 3 failed to reach him. He governed his jungle empire for another decade, until 1544, when he was killed not by Spanish soldiers, but by 7 Spanish fugitives he had made the mistake of giving refuge to. Renegades from the vicious civil wars that had broken out within the Spanish colonial world itself. Men who murdered Inca during what the chronicles describe as an informal game, possibly a ball game, a moment of relaxed trust that they exploited. His son Sayri Tupac eventually negotiated with the Spanish, accepted a formal pardon, and left Vilcabamba. His other son, T2Koc, maintained the resistance, kept the Neo-Inca state functioning in the jungle, and did something remarkable. He dictated a full account of the conquest from the Inca perspective, in his own words, to a Spanish notary in 1570, the only such account by an Inca ruler that survives. And when T2Koc died in 1571, his brother Tupac Amaatru took his place. By 1572, the Spanish viceroy Francisco de Toppled had decided that the Neo-Inca state, this shadow empire in the jungle, this surviving ember of Inca sovereignty that had been burning for 35 years since Inca's escape from Koosco, could no longer be tolerated. Tolerated politically, tolerated as a symbol, tolerated as proof that the conquest was not in fact complete. He launched a military campaign into Vilcabamba with a force specifically equipped and prepared for jungle warfare. The Spanish had learned things in 35 years of failure. They knew now how to move through that terrain, which trails to use, how to maintain supply lines across those river valleys. The city was found. The city was taken. Tupac Amaatru was captured, found, according to some accounts, hiding in the jungle with a small group of followers, wet and cold and far from any remaining position of strength. He was brought to Koosco. On September the 24th, 1572, 40 years after Kahimearka, 40 years after Atahualpa sat in that plaza and waited for Psahro's signal, Tupac Amaatru was brought to the main plaza of Koosco. The chronicles describe tens of thousands of indigenous people present, filling the plaza and the streets around it. The Spanish records note that the crowd was silent in a way that the colonial authorities found genuinely unnerving. Not the silence of indifference, not the silence of a crowd that didn't care what was happening, but the silence of a people witnessing something that mattered to them in a way the Spanish couldn't fully understand or control. Tupac Amaatru was beheaded in that plaza. 40 years of resistance. 40 years of retreat and rebuilding and raids and survival in the jungle. 40 years of maintaining, in whatever form was still possible, the idea that the Shpa Inca existed and the empire was not completely gone. In a plaza in Koosco. On a September morning. In front of tens of thousands of people who were silent. The Inca Empire, Thahuantinesou, the four quarters was over. The political end of the Inca Empire in 1572 was not the end of the catastrophe. The catastrophe had been ongoing since 1527, since the first smallpox case reached the Inca heartland, since the Chasqui runners unknowingly carried the pathogen along roads that had been built for a completely different purpose. The population numbers, and I want to be upfront that these are estimates, because the pre-contact census data that existed in Quipioo records was largely destroyed, and Spanish colonial censuses began too late to capture the earliest and most devastating epidemic mortality. But the estimates that historians have developed from multiple independent sources are consistent enough to tell a clear and devastating story. At European contact, at the moment Inca Empire reached its greatest extent, around 1520, the Andean population stood at somewhere between 9 and 12 million people. The scholars argue about the precise figure, but the range is relatively well established. By 1572, 50 years after contact, the Spanish colonial census estimates suggest approximately 1 million people remained. 1 million from 12 million. By the early 1600s, 80 years after contact, the population had fallen to perhaps 600,000. A reduction of approximately 90% in less than a century. 90%. If you're sitting somewhere right now in a city or a town or a neighborhood of 10 people, by the math of what happened in the Andes after 1520, 9 of those 10 people would be dead, within 80 years of first contact with the outside world. And the critical thing to understand, the thing that changes how you see this entire story, is that most of those people were not killed by Spanish soldiers. Spanish soldiers killed tens of thousands. The conquest was violent. The colonial labor system killed hundreds of thousands more. But the majority of that 90% reduction, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, waves of epidemic disease striking a population with zero immunological defense, one after another, with insufficient recovery time between outbreaks. The same invisible force that had started the whole chain of events in 1527, killing the emperor, triggering the Civil War, breaking the empire before Pizarro arrived, continued doing its work for decades after the political conquest was complete. The disease that conquered before the conquerors arrived kept killing long after the conquerors had won. Those who survived the epidemics faced a different kind of destruction, a slower one, built into the legal and economic structure of the colonial system itself. The Spanish colonial system imposed on the Andes was constructed on a deliberate perversion of one of the Inca Empire's most effective institutions. The Inca mita, the labor tax, had required each household to contribute labor to the state for a defined period each year, building roads, working agricultural fields, serving in the military, maintaining the infrastructure of the empire. In exchange, the state fed and clothed workers during their period of service, maintained the QOLCA food storage network that protected communities from famine, and provided a social safety net that was, by the standards of the 16th century, genuinely remarkable in its effectiveness. It was a system built on reciprocity. You give labor, the state gives security. The Spanish kept the structure. They removed everything that made it work. The colonial mita required indigenous men, specifically men of specific ages from specific communities, to travel to and work in the silver mines of Potosí in what is now Bolivia and the mercury mines of Huancavelica in Peru. These were not temporary assignments with state-provided food and the guarantee of returning home. These were death sentences in slow motion. The mercury mines of Huancavelica mercury is a neurotoxin. Chronic exposure to mercury vapor destroys the nervous system. Workers at Huancavelica breathed it every shift. The effects, tremors, cognitive deterioration, organ failure, were well documented even by contemporaries who didn't fully understand the mechanism. Potosí was different. The altitude, the mines sit at over 13,000 feet above sea level, in cold that is brutal even by Andean standards. Combined with the dust from silver ore that accumulated in workers' lungs, the crushing physical labor, the inadequate food, the absence of any of the support structures the Inca mita had provided. Historians estimate that over the full colonial period, hundreds of thousands of men died in the mines of Potosí alone. Hundreds of thousands. The silver that came out of those mines, billions of dollars worth at modern valuations, financed the Spanish Empire's wars in Europe. It flowed east to Asia through the Manila galleon trade in exchange for Chinese silk and porcelain. It made the early modern global economy function. The men who died underground making all of that possible, their names were not recorded. The Quipo records that might have held their names were destroyed. The colonial record-keeping that replaced those records did not consider them worth individualizing. They are numbers in census tallies, reductions in population counts, gaps in the data. The population collapse was not only a human tragedy measured in lives. It was an epistemological catastrophe, a destruction of knowledge so total and so permanent that we still don't fully understand the scale of what was lost, because the loss includes the ability to know what was lost. The Inca world had accumulated knowledge over centuries, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, encoded in a system of sight lines called K lines, radiating outward from Koosco toward horizon points, marking the rising and setting of celestial bodies at critical moments in the agricultural calendar. Agricultural knowledge about the cultivation of hundreds of distinct varieties of potato, corn, quinoa, and other crops, each variety adapted to a specific altitude, a specific microclimate, a specific set of growing conditions in the extraordinarily varied Andean environment, knowledge about which plants had medicinal properties and how to use them, engineering knowledge about how to build in earthquake-prone high-altitude terrain. The knowledge encoded in the Quipo, the complete administrative, historical, and cultural record of the empire, in a medium that the Spanish did not understand and did not try to understand before they destroyed most of it. Most of this knowledge existed in people, not in books, not in written archives, not in institutions that could survive even if the people who staffed them died. It existed in specialists, in the memories of communities, in oral traditions transmitted from grandmother to granddaughter and from master to apprentice, in living practice. When 90% of those people died within a century, most of that knowledge died with them. Some survived specifically. Some survived because it was encoded in the plants themselves, rather than just in human memory. The potato, domesticated in the Andes over thousands of years into hundreds of distinct varieties, adapted to a range of growing conditions that no other single crop in the world could match, eventually carried to Europe, where it transformed agricultural productivity, fed populations that had been chronically malnourished for generations, supported population growth that fueled the Industrial Revolution. The tomato, the sweet potato, cacao, tobacco, rubber, quinoa, all American domesticates that remade the world's agriculture and diet and economy. The Inca knowledge of agriculture, the knowledge of 12,000 years of human cultivation in the Andes, fed the world. In the form of plants, it survived. The people who developed that knowledge over all those thousands of years, they are mostly gone. Francisco Pizarro did not have long to enjoy what he had built. He founded the city of Kings, Lima, on the Peruvian coast in 1535. He governed Peru as its first Spanish governor. He built a palace. He accumulated wealth on a scale that would have been literally unimaginable to the illegitimate boy from Extremadura who couldn't read or write. And he became entangled in the poisonous internal politics of the Spanish colonial world he had created. His partnership with Diego de Almagro, the co-organizer of the original Peru expeditions, the man without whom the whole enterprise might not have been possible, had collapsed into open, violent conflict. The dispute was fundamentally about money and territory, and who got credit for what. It escalated to armed conflict. Almagro was captured by Pizarro's forces in 1538 and executed on Pizarro's orders. On June the 26th, 1541, 6 years after founding Lima, 8 years after Atahualpa's execution, a group of armed followers of Almagro's son burst into Pizarro's palace in Lima during a Sunday lunch. He fought. The chronicles are consistent on this. He was in his early 60s, possibly his mid-60s, the exact birth year is uncertain, and he had not spent his life behind a desk. He was still physically formidable. He killed at least one of his attackers, possibly more, before he was overwhelmed. He was stabbed multiple times. Different accounts give different versions of his final moments. Some say he drew a cross on the floor in his own blood and died kissing it. Some say he simply bled out on the floor of his own dining room, alone. What is certain is that the man who had conquered an empire of 12 million people with 168 soldiers, who had captured the most powerful emperor in the Western Hemisphere, who had accepted the largest ransom in human history, and then executed the man who paid it, died on the floor of his own house. Killed by the associates of the man he had ordered killed 3 years earlier. The conquistadors consumed each other with almost the same efficiency they had consumed the civilizations they conquered. And not every Spaniard was comfortable with what had happened. Not then, not in the years immediately following. The moral argument was happening in real time within the Spanish colonial world itself, while the conquest was still ongoing. In 1542, less than 10 years after Jaime Arca, while Machenko Inca was still alive in Vilcabamba, Spain issued the new laws, a set of regulations intended to limit the exploitation of indigenous people in the Americas, to restrict the Echenicomi system under which Spanish colonists held indigenous communities as effectively enslaved labor, and to gradually, over time, phase out the worst abuses. The new laws were driven in significant part by the work of one man, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who had been present in the Americas since the early days of Caribbean conquest, who had watched the destruction of indigenous populations firsthand, and who had spent decades doing something that was genuinely dangerous given the political environment, documenting what he saw and arguing publicly that it was wrong. His account, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, circulated widely in Europe. It was passionate, sometimes deliberately provocative in its numbers and descriptions, and completely sustained in its central moral argument. Indigenous people were rational human beings, fully human in every sense that mattered, and what was being done to them was a crime against both human dignity and Christian principle. The new laws were not effectively enforced. The colonists in Peru revolted. The viceroy sent specifically to implement them, Blasco Núñez Villechla, was killed by Pizarro's own brother in the conflict that followed. The laws were amended, softened, rendered largely meaningless in practice. But the debate had happened. The questions had been asked, publicly, officially in the courts of Spain, in the streets of Lima, in the churches of Kosco. Was this right? Was any of this justified? What exactly did Spain owe to the people whose world it had destroyed? Those questions were asked in 1542. They are still being asked. Around 1515, nearly a century after Jaime Arca, a man named Felipe Guamán Piohma de Ayala completed a letter to King Philip III of Spain. The letter was 1,189 pages long. Guamán Piohma was indigenous, a descendant of Inca nobility, a man who had grown up in the colonial world the conquest had created, literate in both Spanish and Quechua, who had spent decades traveling through the Andes, observing what the colonial system was doing to the people of the former empire. What he produced is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of the Americas. The letter contained nearly 400 original illustrations, drawings of Inca life before the conquest, drawings of the conquest itself, drawings of the colonial labor system, drawings of the abuses of colonial officials, drawings of the mines. A complete visual record of before and after, drawn by a man who was trying to make a distant king understand something the king had never seen and could not imagine. He described the epidemic deaths in language that is still devastating to read. He described the Mita labor system and what it was doing to the men sent to the mines. He described the destruction of religious sites, the seizure of community lands, the systematic humiliation of indigenous nobility by colonial administrators who treated the remnants of the greatest empire in the hemisphere as an inconvenience to be managed. And he wrote, in a passage that has stayed with every historian who has read it, "And so it was that God permitted this, because of the great sins committed in this kingdom, that such a small number of Spaniards were able to conquer such a great kingdom." He sent the letter to the King of Spain. It never arrived, or if it arrived, no response was ever sent, no acknowledgement, nothing. The letter disappeared entirely. It was found in 1908, 300 years later, in a library in Copenhagen, Denmark. It had ended up there by complete accident, apparently carried by a Dutch traveler at some unknown point, filed away in an archive, sitting in a drawer in Northern Europe for 3 centuries, while the world it described continued to change. It is now considered one of the most important documents in the history of the Americas. The King of Spain never read it. What remains of the Inca world today is both more and less than you might expect. The stonework survived. This is the part that stops you cold when you actually see it in person, and I mean physically stops you, makes you stand still and stare, because your brain keeps trying to make sense of what your eyes are telling it. The great Inca building tradition, massive stones cut and fitted together without a single drop of mortar, with tolerances so precise that the joint between 2 stones is essentially invisible to the naked eye, proved indestructible by anything the Spanish could throw at it. The Spanish churches built over Inca foundations have cracked and crumbled through 5 centuries of Andean earthquakes. The Inca walls beneath them have not moved, not measurably. The stones sit exactly where the Inca stonemasons placed them, 500 years ago, in a seismically active mountain range, with no mortar holding them together. Sacsayhuaman still stands above Ko, individual stones in its outer walls weighing up to 100 tons, quarried from sources miles away, transported and placed by methods that we still don't completely understand, in an earthquake zone, without iron tools, without wheels, without any of the technology that modern engineers would consider essential for that kind of construction. The terraced hillsides of Inca agriculture, the Adhnas, stone-faced terraces cut into Andean slopes at altitudes above 12,000 feet, engineering a growing surface out of near-vertical mountain terrain, are still visible across Peru and Bolivia. Some are still being actively farmed. And then there is Machu Picchu, the royal estate built by the great Emperor Pachacuti in the middle of the 15th century, perched on a mountain ridge between 2 peaks, surrounded by nearly vertical drops into the river valley far below, built in the characteristic Inca stone style that needs no mortar and survives everything, survived the conquest entirely intact. Because the Spanish never found it. The geography hid it, dense cloud forest on all approaches, no road to it that was obvious from outside. The local communities near the site knew it was there the entire time. They had always known, and continued to use the agricultural terraces below it. It was rediscovered by the Western world in 1911, when an American historian named Hiram Bingham was led to it by a local Quechua-speaking farmer named Melchor Artiga, who had known where it was all along, because his community had always known. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The Spanish spent 40 years trying to find Vilcabamba. They found it eventually, after 3 failed expeditions. They found it because they had enough soldiers and indigenous guides and persistence to push through the terrain. Machu Picchu they never found, because the local people knew where it was and didn't tell them. And they didn't tell them for 300 years. The Inca Empire is gone. But the language the Inca Empire spoke is not. Quechua, the language of the Shpa Inca and the Chasqui runners and the farmers on the Andean terraces, and the lords who carried Atahualpa's litter into that plaza in Cajamarca, is still spoken today. By approximately 8 to 10 million people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile, making it one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages anywhere in the Americas. Not a dead language, not a preserved relic spoken by a handful of scholars in academic settings. A living language, spoken by children in Andean communities as their first language. Spoken by grandmothers explaining things to their grandchildren in words that carry more precision than the Spanish translation. Sung in festivals that colonial authorities tried to ban for centuries and could not quite extinguish. When Atahualpa sat in his golden litter in the plaza of Cajamarca and listened to Vicente de Valverde reading the Requerimiento in Spanish, a language he had never heard, read to him by a stranger demanding his submission, he heard nothing he could understand. When Quechua speakers in the Andes today describe what happened to their ancestors, what the disease did, what the conquest did, what the mines did, they are using the same language Atahualpa spoke. The empire fell. The language lived. Languages are stubborn things. They survive in the mouths of children, in the words that grandmothers use when they want precision, in the songs sung at the festivals that the conquerors tried to stop. They survive because they carry meaning that no other language quite carries, and communities hold onto that meaning even when holding onto it is costly. The Inca Empire built the roads carried the disease killed the emperor's death started the war broke the empire, the Spanish walked in. And the language that the empire spoke is still alive in the mouths of 10 million people. History is rarely as complete as the conquerors intend it to be. We started this with a question. When a civilization collapses, when 12 million people's world ends within the span of a human lifetime, who actually defeated it? And does the answer change what we think about power, vulnerability, and the forces that actually move history? For 500 years, the conventional answer has been Francisco Pizarro, Spanish military superiority, steel weapons, horses, gunpowder, European tactical genius. One civilization overwhelming another, less advanced, less capable civilization through superior technology and force. That answer isn't just incomplete. It's wrong. Francisco Pizarro walked into ruins. He walked into the aftermath of a catastrophe that had already happened. A catastrophe that had been unfolding for 5 full years before he arrived, that had decapitated the empire's leadership, fractured its military command, exhausted its resources, and eliminated the unified authority that was the only thing holding 12 million people together as a single political entity. Smallpox killed Whynak Capac. Whynak Capac's death, sudden, unexpected, without the named successor that would have changed everything, created the succession crisis. The succession crisis created the Civil War. The Civil War killed tens of thousands directly, depleted the food reserves, fractured the military command structure, eliminated most of the Inca royal bloodline in Atahualpa's purge, and left the empire psychologically shattered and physically exhausted. By the time Pizarro marched through those mountain passes in September 1532, the Inca Empire had already done to itself what no external force had ever managed to do. It had broken its own spine. Pizarro didn't defeat the Inca Empire. He arrived after it fell, claimed the credit, and wrote the history. Now and here is where the story stops being just history and starts being something that matters right now. None of this happened because the Incas were primitive, or weak, or inferior in any meaningful sense. The Inca Empire was extraordinary. Its engineering, its agriculture, its administrative sophistication, its road system, its stonework, its food security architecture, extraordinary. It happened because the empire's greatest strength, the total, absolute, theologically grounded authority of the Shpa Inca, was also, in the specific circumstances of 1527, its single point of catastrophic failure. One emperor, no named heir, a pathogen on the road. That is not stupidity. That is not weakness. That is what happens when a system that has never been tested by a specific type of failure encounters exactly that failure. Every civilization has structural assumptions built into it, assumptions about what kinds of threats are possible, what kinds of failures can happen, what the system needs to be resilient against. Those assumptions come from experience. You build resilience against things that have happened before. The Inca Empire had never faced epidemic disease as a geopolitical weapon. No one on Earth had ever conceptualized it as one, because it had never been weaponized before. It was a side effect of contact, not a deliberate strategy. So there was no resilience built in. No redundant succession mechanism. No institution that could maintain imperial authority if the emperor died suddenly. No way to prevent a pathogen from traveling along the roads that kept the empire alive. The tragedy isn't that the Incas made wrong choices. The tragedy is that the right choices were invisible to them. Because you can only build resilience against threats you can imagine. This story is 500 years old. And it is not finished. In 2020, a pathogen moved along the invisible roads of global aviation and international trade, the modern equivalent of those 25,000 miles of Inca highways, the system that connects every point on Earth to every other point within hours. It disrupted supply chains built on decades of assumptions about stability. It exposed the single points of failure in healthcare systems, political institutions, and economic structures that had been optimized for efficiency at the cost of resilience. It killed heads of state. It destabilized political successions in multiple countries. It demonstrated, in real time, that invisible biological forces can reshape global order faster than any army, any election, any financial crisis. The Inca road system was the most sophisticated communication and transportation infrastructure in the pre-Columbian Americas. It carried the thing that destroyed everything. The question that the Inca story asks of every civilization, including ours right now today, is not, are you strong? Every civilization believes it's strong. The Incas were strong. The question is, What are the invisible roads that carry the threats you haven't imagined yet? What are the systems you've built, the systems that make your civilization function, that carry your authority and your food and your information and your economy? What would happen if those systems carried the one thing you hadn't planned for? Every civilization believes its greatest strength is visible. The Incas believed exactly the same thing. In Kiosko today, you can stand in the complex that was the Coricaen, the Temple of the Sun. The upper structure is the Spanish Church of Santo Domingo, built by the conquerors in the 16th century, cracked and partially rebuilt after major earthquakes, repaired and modified over 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial history. Below it, visible through an open section where the ground has been cut away, and along the exterior walls that were incorporated into the church's structure, are the Inca stones. The original Inca stones. Fitted without mortar, edges cut to tolerances that are still difficult to fully explain with modern understanding of what tools were available. Surfaces fitted so precisely that 5 centuries of major earthquakes in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth have not moved them. The Spanish church cracks. The Inca stones hold. Atahualpa paid the largest ransom in human history and was executed anyway. Huayna Capac died of a disease he had never heard of, in a city far from his capital, before meeting a single European. The roads that built the empire carried the pathogen that destroyed it. And the stones that the Inca stonemasons fitted together without mortar, without iron tools, without the wheel, at 11,000 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains. They are still standing, exactly where they were placed, still holding. Thank you for staying with this one all the way to the end. Genuinely. This is a long one, and if you made it here, you know why it had to be. I want to ask you something specific, something that came up for me repeatedly through the entire research process for this video, something I kept coming back to and still don't have a clean answer to. If Huayna Capac had survived smallpox, if the disease had passed him by, or arrived a year later, or hit his court without killing him, and he had formally designated a single clear successor before his death, could the Inca Empire have repelled Pizarro's 168 men? Think about what that actually means. A unified empire, no civil war, no 4 years of Andean cities burning and food reserves being depleted and military commanders fighting each other instead of the Spanish. A functioning imperial command structure. Generals Keys and Chalcuchimac answering to a single emperor rather than frozen by the paralysis of a captured god-king. Could 168 men, even with horses, even with gunpowder, even with the biological immunity that had already killed so many, could they have walked into that? Or was the Spanish conquest inevitable regardless of Inca political unity? Was the technological and biological gap simply too large to bridge, no matter who sat on the throne in Kiosko? And if the answer is that a unified empire could have survived, that Cajamarca was not inevitable, that it was the direct consequence of a civil war, that was the direct consequence of one emperor dying without naming his heir, then what do we make of everything that followed? 12 million people, 90% gone within a century. Was any of it avoidable? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and this is a question I genuinely don't have a clean answer to, which means your answer actually matters to how I think about this. If this story stayed with you, if the idea that the infrastructure of a civilization can become the transmission network for its own destruction is still turning in your mind right now, Then the next video is going to feel like this story told from the other side of the world. The complete history of the Silk Road. 4,000 miles of trade route, 2,000 years of history. Every empire that controlled it rose to wealth and power and left its mark on how the world works today. Every empire that lost control of it fell. And here is the one detail to carry with you until then. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, the empire that stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland, made the Silk Road so safe that the chronicles describe a woman carrying a gold plate being able to walk from one end to the other unharmed. That's safe. Under Mongol protection, the Silk Road became the most secure long-distance trade corridor in the world. Those same roads carried Eurasiania, the Black Death, from Central Asia to the Middle East and then to Europe. The Mongols built the safest highway in the history of the world. And it killed a third of humanity. The roads that create wealth create shadows. The pattern continues. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're new here, this is what this channel does. Long-form, immersive history. The complete stories of civilizations, empires, and the invisible forces that built them and broke them. Told slowly enough that the weight of what happened actually has time to settle into you. The hidden causes behind the catastrophes everyone thinks they already know. The human beings behind the numbers. The emperor dying in Quito before any European reached him. The 80,000 soldiers standing paralyzed on a hillside while their god was captured 40 yards away. The man who paid the largest ransom in human history and was strangled anyway, calm and unbowed, in the same plaza where 6,000 of his people had already died. The stories behind the stories. Subscribe, and I will see you on the Silk Road.